Returning to the situation in Syria, outgoing Prime Minister Mohammed al-Jalani has agreed to hand over the reins following a meeting with rebel leader Abu Mohammed al-Jalani in Damascus.
The meeting comes a day after rebels stormed the capital, the culmination of a 12-day lightning offensive. Both men reportedly discussed the transition of power to the rebel-led Salvation government. The rebels have said that they will grant amnesty to military personnel conscripted into service under Assad.
Rebel leader Jalani has promised an inclusive government and religious tolerance. He says the opposition will not completely dispense with the old regime. And for more insights on the unfolding situation in Syria as well as the Middle East, let's speak now with Kateba Idelbi, resident scholar, senior fellow, for Syria with the Atlantic Council. Taiba, thank you very much for joining us. So we're in the early stages right now, but the business of governing has started. Jalani has so far said the right things. We know that even dropping his nom de guerre, he's back to Ahmad Hussein al-Shara. But what's he done on the ground so far? Are you encouraged? Is he keeping his word about being accommodating towards Syria's minorities, for example?
I mean, I think it has been so far so good in the sense that Jolani and HTS has been walking the walk as they talk the talk. I think there are many challenges coming ahead, and I think we need to watch what's going to come next. HTS and Jolani has been governing Idlib province for the last 4 years, and they've definitely shown improvement in the way they govern, in the way they deal with minority communities, in the way of allowing more freedoms for the general public. But Idlib province, in a sense, is a one tone where it is one specific community, a suburban community that is very much unlike other metropolitan centers like Aleppo. Damascus is definitely different than Alawite, or not as diverse as you have Alawites, Christians, Shia Ismailis, and others. So there's definitely a challenge coming ahead. And I think the way he's going to govern on this interim basis in Damascus, Aleppo, and other places would really show if HTS has really improved the way we've seen it in Idlib in the last 4 years.
Yeah, a sense of cautious optimism there, Katabi, but we don't have to look far back in history to find similar moments. Different context, but, fall of Hussein in Iraq in 2003, or Mubarak in Egypt, or Gaddafi in Libya, where the aftermath was far from perfect. So what do you think will make the difference in this case? What factors could lead to a more stable transition?
I think the only difference we see right now is the way the transition has been managed. In the last 12 days, we've seen very minimal civilian casualties, despite Syria's very diverse background, very diverse communities religiously and ethnically. We haven't seen any sectarian clashes in the last 2 weeks, despite the complete fall of the government. And again, compared to Egypt, Iraq, or Libya, we haven't seen really any of that immediate violence and chaos that we've seen in the aftermath of those regime changes. So that is, I think, making a lot of Syrians very optimistic about the future. I think the main challenge will be, however, is how could HTS and the rebels figure out an agreement between them first, but also an agreement that could include all of those Syrian different communities. But before actually moving into transition, I think we're probably going to look at a period of 6 months to a year, probably, where the rebels will have to actually prove themselves in governing and stabilizing the situation. Yes, the Assad regime has fallen. Yes, the Syrian people and the different communities have proven that they can, even in a power vacuum, that they can still manage the situation. But it will take a lot of efforts from the rebels to make sure that the stabilized effort or the stabilized situation will continue and be more permanent before looking into what the future would look like.
HTS will also have to figure out what to do with Iran and Russia at some point. I mean, both countries widely blamed for empowering Assad's reign of terror against his own people. Do you think HTS will allow them to stay, or will HTS have to make them leave?
So for Iran, Iran is already out of Syria. Iran doesn't really have any bases or locations where it can still continue to have presence. Their militias have run away either into Iraq, or their allied militias with Hezbollah have run into Lebanon. So we're not talking now about any Iranian presence in the region. However, Russia still maintains a naval and an air base in Western Syria. And HTS have communicated, at least to the Russians, that they're okay with them having this base for now. I think what HTS is thinking long term is, how do you balance relations with both the West and the East at the same time? So you don't want to manage a situation where you have to also go in a battle with Russia. I think the question is, how do you manage their presence and an equal relation or a balanced relationship between Russia and the United States? We have to remember here that both Iran and Russia have signed binding agreements with the Syrian state under the Assad regime that the future government, whether it is HTS or someone else, will have to deal with. So far, Iran has been on its end, has been moderating its language towards Syria. We've seen Iran official media talking about how they actually advised Assad to reform, to listen to his own people. So if they manage to maintain that semi-positive environment with both countries, they will be able then to manage a solution out of those commitments that the Assad regime have created with both countries over the last 10 years, which are over $100 billion in worth.
We can't forget about the reign of terror, of course, and more than 12 million people have been displaced and over 100,000 disappeared under Assad's regime. With the Syrian leader now on the run, we know he's in Russia, but what's the prospect of bringing him to justice for his crimes?
That is an important question, I think, for all of Syrians, as we've seen the scenes of almost 50,000 Syrians gathering around the infamous Sinai prison. A lot of people for the last 2 days have been just tearing that prison apart, looking for their relatives. And I think people are just arriving at the reality that the Assad regime has killed the vast majority of the 150,000 people it has disappeared over the last decade. As they topple with this reality, I think there is a lot of work needed on transitional justice, on trying to figure out how would these facts basically not affect the dynamics between the different sects in Syria, especially with communities that have been aligned with the Assad regime for the last 60 years. But as part of that, I think there are some dynamics that could be put in place that can protect the country from such sectarian clash. So one part of that is, I think there needs to be an international support for the process of recovering and identifying bodies from mass graves that the Assad regime has created before actually the search for bodies turn into more chaos. There needs to be some, at least mechanisms where some symbolic justice could be put in place. But more importantly, while Assad has left to Moscow and some of his top officers have left to the United Arab Emirates and other places, the majority of his regime is still in Syria. I think there has been an important step by the rebels today to give general amnesty to all the low-level ranking soldiers and officers within the Assad army. But there needs to be some justice brought by those high-level officials who are currently in hiding in Syria. And I think the sooner that is done, the more peace it can bring to different communities around Syria.
Understood. Quick question about the broader context for the Middle East now. I mean, Iran hasn't had a good year, 2024, with this axis of resistance much degraded. I mean, what do you see it doing now? Will it lie low? Will it seek new negotiations with the incoming Trump administration? Or is it going to speed up its pursuit of a nuclear bomb? Very quickly, if you don't mind, sir.
I think Iran is really left with not a lot of choices. Considering the current leadership, I would imagine that they would want to extend an olive branch to the Trump administration. I think Iran is really not very close to establishing a bomb. I think if the United States and Israel have known that Iran is very close to establish a bomb, they would have targeted actually the Iranian nuclear program. But Iran is in place with the loss of Syria and potentially Lebanon now. Iran is in a very difficult place. And I think with the current leadership, they would really try to work a deal where they can prevent an Israeli-American attack on their nuclear program and try to figure out how they can approach the region again after the loss of their strategic positioning in Syria.
Understood. We have to leave it there, unfortunately. Qutaiba, thank you very much for talking to us on Asia First. Qutaiba It'll is Resident Senior Fellow, Syria, with the Atlantic Council.